Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Für Freuden, laßt und springen, which translates to Good Christians all, rejoice ye. Overall, fairly straightforward chorale, not too much to write home about in the harmony department, but we do have some interesting developments going on at the end of this chorale that we will talk about when we get to it. But in the interim, we're just going to start the analysis. So 2 flats in the key signature. We start on G minor and we end on G major. So I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is G minor, and we do have 2 flats in this key signature, which is typically indicative of Bach's relationship with key signatures. But from previous analyses of chorales, especially in G minor and C minor, we see that Bach often uses a key signature that doesn't just by first glance tell us what key we're in, so it's good to use the rest of the chorale for context to piece together what the overall tonality is. Here in this case, coincidentally, the key signature reflects that, but sometimes we see G minor chorales with 1 flat in the key signature. So after our tonic triad, we have some passing tones in the lower voices and a neighbor tone in the alto here. A, C, F sharp, and D is D7 over A, which is 5-4-3. And then we get G minor again, B flat, D, G, and D, which is 1-6. C is a passing tone, C is also a passing tone. This B flat is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we get D, A, F sharp, and D again, which is our 5 chord, D major. Then we get some melodic minor going on here. We have E as a passing tone, G is a passing tone, but we don't really have an analyzable chord, perhaps some inferred harmony, but not really anything that's analyzable based on the notes that are present on the page. We then have F sharp, A, and D, which is just taking our D major chord and inverting it. It's the first inversion, 5-6, so we don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral. And then we get some more passing tones, G, B flat, G, and with that D right there, this gives us a 1 chord off of the harmonic rhythm. And here we get a bit of an interesting progression. We have A, G, and C. Now I reckon this is just like a 7-6 suspension over the bass, but typical Bach fashion is for him to swap the bass on us when we get the resolution of that suspension. So I do think we do have a bit of an implied 2 chord here, and we would know that a 2 chord is half diminished, typically speaking, because we would be expecting an E flat in the key of G minor. Even though we do see E natural here, this is a byproduct of the melodic minor scale. Sometimes we do see minor 7 chords in minor keys because of the melodic minor scale, but here we have no 5th, so we don't know what the quality of the chord is. But there's a reason why I think this 2 chord is present here in the texture, and it has to do with the progression we're going to see later. But afterwards, this 2 also strengthening the argument of the fact that there is an implied 2 chord happening here, despite the fact that it's incomplete. We have D, D, F sharp, and with this C here, we have an incomplete 5-7 chord, and I feel like that's significant because 2 going to 5 over this subdivided chord progression eventually resolves to 1 on the next beat, G, D, G, and B flat, tonic triad, root position, passing tone in the bass, neighbor tone in the alto. Kind of get a bit of an augmented 7 chord here, but I think really what Bach's implying is like a dominant triad with this B flat being held over in the melody. But after our 1 chord, we have B flat, D, G, and B flat. It's another tonic triad, this time in first inversion, so we'll just change the figured bass. Another passing tone in the bass before our half cadence here in the key of G minor, where we cadence on 5, D, D, F sharp, and A. 5 chord. Moving ahead, we have a perfect, not a perfect authentic cadence, but an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of B flat major. So we are going to get a modulation, and I think it happens right off the bat. We start off with B flat major, B flat, D, F, and D, which is our 3 chord in the key of G minor. And I think that there are a couple of different ways you can go about analyzing this. I think that you could say that this is a common chord modulation like I am, where B flat goes from 3 in the key of G minor to 1 in the key of, not G minor. G minor was just on my mind, that's why I wrote that, but rather 1 in the key of B flat major. Or you could say this is a direct modulation as well, with the juxtaposition of F sharp and F natural happening here. To me, 5 going to 3, 3 is kind of, you do see 5 go to 3 sometime in minor keys. We see it in major keys as well. All in all, it's fairly minute detail and doesn't really make too much of a difference in the analysis, in my opinion. So you can omit them if you'd like and just analyze this as a direct modulation. You don't even need to classify what type of modulations are happening in the chorale, so long as you know that there is a key change happening by the time you get into the next phrase. That's the more important musical skill you should have if you're trying to develop a stronger relationship with this music. But after our one chord, we have a passing seventh in the bass and a passing tone in the tenor, before we get G minor again. And to me, it sounds like the melody is moving towards the idea of B flat major, just because we're hovering in and around the 3 of the scale. We don't have G sharps, we have E flats. It feels like we're just using diatonic pitch material here, and the avoidance of F sharps and just D majors, F sharp diminished chords really makes this feel more like a B flat major sound world than a G minor sound world. So even though we're getting this G minor in pretty close proximity to the previous phrase, which was in the key of G minor, I feel like we're already in the key of B flat. So this is our 6th chord, G, B flat, G, and D. Passing seventh in the bass, passing tone in the melody, and then we get E flat, B flat, F, and F. I reckon this E flat is an accented non-chord tone, and we actually have D, B flat, F, and F, which is just taking our tonic triad, putting it in first inversion. Kind of an unusual progression here, 1, 6, 1. Really, G minor and B flat major are largely similar chords. The only difference is F and G. Otherwise, they're the same pitches, so this really feels like a lot of B flat major going on here for 3 beats. But after our B flat major chord, we have C, B flat, C, and E. And this is actually harkening back to why I feel like this is a 2-5 progression here, even though a 2 chord in the key of, or in a minor key, we would expect to have the 5th of the chord as part of the chord in the way that it's spelled for context. We have an incomplete 7 chord here where there's no G in the chord, and it is also a subdivided 2-7 to 5-7 progression. So this feels almost as if like these 2 progressions are like kindred spirits in the way that they're structured. So C, B flat, C, and E flat. That is C minor 7. Incomplete, of course, but with minor 7 chords, not nearly as important as minor 7 flat 5 chords, or just diminished triad chords in general, in terms of including the 5th, because the 5th is what gives the chord its quality, the diminished chord its quality, that is. With minor chords, it's the 3rd between the root and the first 3rd of the chord that gives it its quality, because we just imply that it's going to have a perfect 5th. So these chords sound the same if you don't hear them that way, so it's hard to know what quality is which unless you have the 5th or you're in a major key, which in this case we're in a major key, so we know. But this F here and this A, along with this C and E flat, gives us F7, so 2-7 going to 5-7 really does feel like what's going on here is something similar between these 2 chord progressions, which sort of informed this analysis here. And then we go to B flat, F, C, and D. So I reckon this C is a 9/8 suspension over the bass, and this is just an implied tonic triad. But by the time we get the resolution here, the bass changes to D, F, B flat, and D. So I think there's also an argument to be made that you can call this a 1/6 chord. I don't really think it makes too much of a difference, because ultimately what's being implied on this beat is a tonic triad. What inversion it's in is not, like I said, super important. But afterwards we have E flat, G, B flat, and C. That's C minor 7 over E flat, 2-6-5. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. This C is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. F, F, A, and C. That's our 5 chord, F major in root position. And then we cadence on our tonic, B flat, F, B flat, and D. B flat major. Alright, moving ahead to the next phrase, we have a half cadence in the key of G minor. And I think very similarly to the way that we got into this phrase, the second phrase of the A section, we're moving into the key of G minor at the same point metrically at the pickup through the same chord. So we have B flat, F, B flat, and D. That's a tonic triad in B flat major, so no need to reanalyze there. But in the key of G minor, it is our 3 chord. And for the same, I feel like the modulation is already sort of unfolding at this point just because of the way the melody is moving. We are starting on the 5 of the scale and moving our way down towards the tonic. And it's interesting to hear B flat major have such a different effect on the sound depending on the way that it's contextualized. Like you hear B flat, that sounds still sort of resonant in the brain, or it's still sort of ringing in the ear, and then when you hear what's happening after the fact, it really does inform the context in which B flat is being framed here. And also from a convenience standpoint, analytically speaking, it feels like there is some symmetry between the phrases here, which is a little bit more speculative, but still my outlook on the chorale. But after this passing 7th here, we have C, E flat, G, and C, and the chord progression here starts to get a little wild, just because of the fact that we have a chromatic bass line here: C, C sharp, D, E flat, E natural, F, F sharp, and G. Quite an extensive chromatic bass line here, and when they're ascending, typically less wild than descending chromatic bass lines, but ascending chromatic bass lines are much more common in the chorales than descending ones, but ones this long are relatively uncommon. So let's see how Bach handles it. We go to C minor, C, E flat, G, and C. That is our 4 chord in the key of G minor, so a bit of adjacent harmony to start things off. A neighbor tone in the tenor as well. Sorry, I had to reposition my microphone there. And then we get C, E natural, G, and B flat. Now, there might be an argument here that this is a C7 chord, which would be melodic minor, but I don't really see a lot of melodic minor going on here. However, because this E natural feels more so associated with this C sharp, and we get this idea of sort of these chromatic passing tones happening on the ands of the even numbered beats. So I feel like the C might actually be like a lower, not necessarily a suspension, but rather just raised a half step below what the actual chord tone is. And here, if we take this C sharp and treat it like our root, this is C sharp fully diminished 7th, which is 7, 7, 5, because C sharp is the leading tone to D, and that takes us to D, A, G, and A. Of course, this G is probably a 4/3 suspension over the bass, but when we take this F sharp into consideration, it is our 5 chord, so it resolves the way we would expect. This D is a chord tone, this C is a passing 7th, and then we get E flat, B flat, G, and G. Sorry, that's the same note. E flat major is our 6 chord in the key of G minor, and then we have this passing E natural here, which has a little bit less of an impact on the overall tonality of the chorale. I think there are a couple of ways you can analyze this. For me, I think what's happening is this is actually 4, 6, E natural, C, G, and G. But I think another way you could analyze this is C major, which could be 5, 6 of 7. There's some potential there. It's not very common to tonicize 7, but sometimes we see it that way. Here, I feel like there's really no problem, especially after yesterday's chorale saying that we have a melodic minor sort of 4 chord. That's a byproduct of raising the 6th scale degree going to 7, especially in this ascending chromatic context. You know, when you're in a chromatic bass line, sometimes convention or just the normative chord progressions you would expect when there isn't chromaticism going on in the bass line have to be cast aside just for a moment until the bass line ends. So I feel like maybe 4 going to 7 is more of an accurate depiction, even though it also sort of takes the form as 5, 6 of 7 as well, just because 4 wants to go to 7. But then we have F, A, C, and A. That is our subtonic 7 chord, F major in root position. And then we get some non-chord tones here. We have F sharp, D. C is a chord tone and A is a chord tone, so we have this would be D major over F sharp, and that'd be 5, 6. So sometimes we do see subtonic 7th go to 5, just because subtonic 7th doesn't have the same dominant properties that a leading tone 7th chord has, just because it's absent of the leading tone. It's just another major chord, so it's stable but in close proximity to the tonic. So sometimes we see it go to 5, and in most cases we see 5 go to another stable chord, usually 1. G, B flat, D, and B flat In this case, that's our 1 chord, passing tone in the bass, and then we get this, we get some more non-chord tones as well. This G is actually a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it, but C sharp and E natural are both not chord tones, so we could analyze this like we saw earlier as 7, 7 of 5, C sharp, G, E natural, and B flat, and this is just being used as a predominant chord to slightly tonicize D major, D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our 5 chord. Okay, looking at our last phrase, probably the most interesting phrase of the chorale, just because of the, like, sort of its form factor, its profile, and its shape is very interesting as well. We get this A flat just sort of sprung on us very interestingly. We end with an imperfect authentic cadence. This is 2 chorales in a row that we've seen not end on a perfect authentic cadence, which is pretty interesting, and 2 chorales in a row that we've seen that has been, or that have been, void of any perfect authentic cadences, which is pretty interesting as well. But I feel like that's mostly coincidental. Regardless, we're going to start this chorale off in the key of G minor, then we're going to briefly move, if you're already ahead of me here, based on this A flat, probably moving to the key of C minor very briefly before we revisit G minor, and then see the chorale out to its end. So we start off with F, D, A, and D. This is actually an F sharp, so this is just taking our D major chord and inverting it, first inversion, and that takes us to G minor, G, D, A, and B flat. I think a tonic triad is being implied here, even though this A is a 9/8 suspension over the bass, and then in typical Bach fashion we see this change of bass over the suspension. We get E flat, G, and B flat, which is our 6 chord, and I think this begins the point in which you could make an argument that we've modulated to the key of C minor. It doesn't quite feel that way to me yet, but you know, it's fairly close in proximity. I heard it right here on beat 3, but really anywhere from this point beyond could be a valid point to mark the modulation. But this passing, or these 2 passing tones in the bass, or the lower voices, and this F that's being created, sort of like a syncopation going on here. We have F, and B flat. It's like B flat major and first inversion, so 6 going to 3, 6. It's a transitive progression, like I've mentioned, this idea of chords typically wanting to resolve down a 5th when we're talking about root movement. So by that nature, 3 would want to go to 6, but that same voice leading Bach uses to go in the opposite direction, so it's less a comment on chords always having to go down a 5th, and more so a comment on the fact that chords being a 5th apart have a special relationship, and the fact that they have 2 notes in common, or sorry, 1 note in common and 2 notes that are different, and that common tone creates congruence between the 2 chords. But after this 3/6 chord, we go to C minor, C, G, F, and C, but this F is a 4/3 suspension over the bass, and we get a 4 chord, which I believe in the key of C minor is our tonic, and we're going to briefly visit the key of C minor for the next couple of beats. We then have C, F, A flat, and D. This is D minor 7 flat 5 over C, which is 2/4/2, and as we know with 4/2 chords, they resolve down a 5th and to a chord that's in first inversion. So this B is here, this D is here. That's actually a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we have G, these are both sort of anticipatory. This one just happens to be tied over, but when we take the aggregate of all the tones, we have B, D, G, and D, which is 5/6. So the root goes down a 5th to 5 is a 5th below 2, and it is in first inversion. So it follows that rule. And most 4/2 chords do follow that rule. Pretty much all of them do, actually, with a couple of them following a particular resolution pattern that I talk about in videos where we encounter them. You can find them in actually some of my more recent videos, not too long in the past. But after our 2/5 progression, we would expect 1, which is C minor, C, D, G, and E flat. So this D is another 9/8 suspension, this time in the tenor, but our tonic still being implied. C and C are both chord progressions, so we don't, or sorry, chord tones. C and C are both chord progressions, my bad. This C minor is a common chord. However, back to the key of G minor, which I think all this really was a very brief revisit or visit to C minor, and now we're talking in terms of G minor for the rest of the chorale. But here we have sort of a similar chord progression going on here, at least in rhythm, to what's going on in the previous measure. We have C, D, G, and D, but I reckon this C is like a lower suspension here, and what we really have is B flat, E, G, and D, which is E minor 7 flat 5 over B flat, a very interesting chord. That would be 6-4-3, and you know, this is a byproduct of harmonizing the melodic minor scale, but Bach does not see it to fruition. He goes from F sharp back down to A and starts working his way around, but the tenor actually never sees that G for the rest of the chorale. It's just implied in other voices. So after our 6-4-3 chord, we go to A, F sharp, A, and C, which is 7-6, 6 going to 7. It's a very common adjacent harmony. It's almost as if really the real trajectory of this progression is 4 going to 7, and 6 is sort of a greater passing chord between these two. But in kind of an interesting fashion, Bach does not resolve this the way we would expect. So the bass does resolve down to G, that's pretty typical, but with this A right here, it's kind of unusual what's going on. I guess you could make the argument that there is like a 2-4-2 chord happening here, in the same way that we have it going on here. So maybe there is potential for 2-4-2 to be happening. I'm going to put a question mark there because it doesn't quite feel that way, but the second that's created between the tenor and the bass here is pretty unusual. However, the 2 chord in terms of its function on the overall progression could be quite great because it is implying a sort of a break in between the 2 dominant chords. Here we have 7 and here we have 5, F sharp, D, A, and C, which is 5-6-5. So the 4-2 chord does resolve where we would expect it to go. It's just very similar to the 2-7 chord that we saw earlier. It's missing a 5th, so it's hard to quantify, or I guess qualify, because we're trying to determine the quality of the chord. Because with the 5th being missing, we don't know if it's a diminished triad or if it is a minor triad. Not that it would really matter too much because it's sort of functioning the same way, but you know, it is something to speculate about. But regardless, the resolution happens the way we would expect it to, and the fact that we saw a similar progression earlier right here is an argument for the fact that this might be happening. It also, something that I've been talking about in recent videos, is the buffer between consecutive dominant functioning chords. 7 going to 5 or 5 going to 7 are typically not the strongest chord progressions, and usually there are passing tones between the 2 chords to create a zone that separates the 2 chords in terms of function and similarity, because not only do 7 and 5 chords largely operate in the same way, but they also share most of their pitch content in common with one another. They both have F sharp and A in this context, so the real difference is C versus D. That's just the nature of triads that are a third apart from one another. But regardless, let's keep trucking along. After our 5-6-5 chord, we have G, E flat, G, and C. Kind of like a 4-6-4 chord here, C minor over G. And it's kind of interesting because, again, we have sort of this buffer between 2 dominant chords. Of course, it's not really as common between 2 5 chords, but we do see 2 dominant chords in succession and another set of non-chord tones, or a subdivided chord progression, to create space between them. That's something that Bach does quite consistently. D, D, F sharp, and D is our 5 chord in root position. C is a little passing 7th. B flat is a non-chord tone. G sort of creates this 4-3 suspension on the next beat as well, but we have another 5 chord implied. And then by the time the resolution occurs, we have C, F, and D. With the C here, I do believe it becomes a chord tone, so maybe we can call this chord on this beat here 5-7, because the C occurs at the same time as the resolution. And then we cadence on G major, G, D, G, and B natural. It's kind of interesting to see the Picardy third in the melody here, but all in all, a fairly conventional ending. We usually see an authentic cadence at the end. Typically it's perfect authentic, but here we see an imperfect authentic cadence, and that in and of itself is a little bit interesting, but not as fascinating as yesterday's ending, which was a half cadence. If you haven't checked out yesterday's video, you should check it out as well. But that is today's analysis. Really the only two things that are, I guess, worth mentioning are, I thought it was pretty interesting here that there is sort of some potential for an augmented triad with the A, the D, the F sharp, and the B flat. An augmented triad popping up for a brief moment here is a little tidbit that I thought was interesting, but in reality, in the big picture, that's probably not what's happening, but we do hear some augmented chord action happening for a brief moment in time here, and also this chromatic bass line, probably the hallmark of this chorales, the chromatic bass line. He sort of seamlessly incorporates it here, but we do get some interesting harmonic progressions throughout, like 7 going to 5, and 6 going to 4, those being bridged together with a series of 7 and 5 chords. But other than that, fairly straightforward chorale, really not too much to write home about, and I'm going to end the video on that note. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.